When I was a senior in law school, just entering my last semester, I took a course in English constitutional law from a visiting professor who was a distinguished old gentleman. He was a retired brigadier general from the British Army, had served in Palestine with Lawrence of Arabia, and had served thereafter in the Judge Advocate General's capacity in the British Army. He was going to teach us English constitutional law, and I well remember on the first day of class together, he strode into the amphitheater precisely on schedule, dressed in an impeccable British three-piece suit. We're going to change microphones here simply because the wind's a little bit distracting and the program is being taped and we'd like a clean copy. So the professor strode into the classroom in this perfectly tailored British suit, made little circles with his thumbs and index fingers, hooked those into his vest pockets, elevated his nose about 20 degrees as if to survey this rabble that proposes to study English law. And then he let us have it. He reminded us quite unnecessarily that of those of us who had begun in our freshman year, about half of us were still there, and that of those of us who had survived, perhaps half could expect to pass the bar exam. And then he gave us some fatherly advice. He said, go back to your apartments today. Take your radios and your televisions, take your reading matter, everything that doesn't pertain to the study of law, and to use his charming expression, throw them on the rubbish. Now, the reason he said that was that he was convinced that where we were going, the stakes were high and so were the challenges, and we were running out of time. There is a difference, however, between that law school class in the spring of 1967 and you folk. Because as I stand here looking at you today, I think about General Miller's advice. The difference is we had 25 years. You don't. Go back just a little bit over a year. There was a Russian cosmonaut, a Soviet cosmonaut by the name of Krikalev, Sergei Krikalev. He was a cosmonaut third class. He was launched into orbital mission from the Cosmodrome in the central USSR, because you see, back then the USSR still existed. The idea was he would spend about 5 months in Earth orbit doing whatever it was he was supposed to do. So he launched, mated with the space vehicle satisfactorily, and began circling the Earth. Every 90 minutes he would circle. And when the cloud cover would permit, he could look down through it at that awesomely huge expanse of land called the Rodina, the motherland, great landmass of brown and blue. And as the summer weeks wore by, just a little over a year ago, it must have seemed to that lonely cosmonaut that the world some 100 miles beneath him was descending into madness. Because he got word that down in the southern part of the Soviet Union, Comrade Gorbachev was in house arrest. Something was going wrong in the motherland. Well, when October came around, it became obvious just how bad things were going wrong, because he got the kind of message no military officer ever likes to get. Said, Comrade Krikalev, we are unable to meet your expected return date in October. Remain in orbit. We will advise you when we can bring you home. The fact was they couldn't afford to bring him down. Their economy was destroyed. Couldn't afford to launch his replacement. So the weeks rolled by. And winter came. Now the Rodina was covered in white. The whole landmass of Mother Russia turned to white and black, monochrome. And on he went, circling the Earth. Early springtime came, and way down in the southern part of the country, down near the Caucasus, down near the plains of Georgia, you begin to see little holes of brown eating into that covering of white. Spring was coming, and still the man is in orbit. It was well into this year before he got the word he could come back. And he came back to the kind of culture shock I doubt very many people have had in the history of the world. The nation that had launched him no longer existed. Gone. In many respects, gone as if it had never been. His hometown of Leningrad was now St. Petersburg. Tavarish Gorbachev, Comrade Gorbachev, is now a capitalist signing contracts to do books and speaking appearances. And his uniform. I'm going to need two hands for this, so let me just hold it up for you. And if we could switch to the pedestal mic for a moment, I'll appreciate it. His uniform that once bore the insignia Soyuz Sovietskih Socialistichestik Respublik USSR. That thing is now a museum piece. And his monthly salary would not even buy a pair of shoes. I said it last night, I will say it again, I believe it is time for Jesus to come. I believe that, like a river, human events have entered into a descending canyon from which there is no return. I believe we are so far into that process it is irreversible. In other words, I mean that I think I see evidence that this time heaven has committed to the coming of Jesus. No more false starts like in 1856 or in the 1890s. No more backing up into the wilderness to accommodate the faithless and too often world-loving people that claim to be waiting for Jesus. This time, I think it's all the way home. And in a sense, I believe that Jesus' parable of the wedding invitation is being acted out in our lives. And the invitation that lingered for so many decades in what we think is the first world is now going into the highways and hedges of the globe, and people by the hundreds of thousands are coming to the gospel in places where just a short time ago we couldn't even go. I think it's time to go home. And I believe that the single best evidence of that is the fact that the Soviet Union has collapsed. Now, that's my conclusion. Let me share with you this morning just a few reasons why I think that is so. Open the Word, if you would like, to follow along to Revelation 13. And we begin with verse 6. Or I should say, let's begin with verse 11. Save just a little bit of time here and move quickly. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. And he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on earth in the sight of men. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their forehead, and that none might buy or sell, save he that had the name, the mark, or the number. And he causeth the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed, and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Now, it seems to me that Revelation 13 graphically portrays a time in this world's history in which, out of an unpopulated part of this planet, a phenomenal new nation would rise meteorically to world power, and it would begin with the twin concepts of civil and religious liberty, and we'll talk about that after lunch this afternoon. Something goes wrong, and very rapidly this world power that speaks with authority to the world makes an ancient and tragic mistake. It believes that you can legislate morality. And it combines with great religious movements in this world and propels the globe to a constitutional crisis such as has never been seen in history. Now let's talk about why I think the fall of the Soviet Union is such a dramatic signal. The story begins back on June 7 of 1982. It was an early summer day in Italy, you know, the kind of day that makes the whole world want to be Italian. Beautiful oncoming summer sweeping in off the Mediterranean. And there in the center of Italy, in a room pungent with the scent of leather-bound books and heavy with the sense of human history, two men are seated deep in private conversation. They're seated comfortably in large brown brocaded chairs. The chairs are drawn close together as though this conversation is very personal and very important. One of the men is dressed in a plain brown suit. The other one is wearing the white robes of a great world cleric. And the one wearing the priestly robes is leaning forward in the seat, his chin resting on his right hand. And he's the very picture of a kindly old parish priest hearing confession. The place was the Vatican Library. The men were the President of the United States and a man known to 1 billion believers in this world as the Holy Father. They had much in common. Within the last few months before that meeting, each of them had been dropped by a gunshot. Each had felt the chilling breeze of death draw very, very near. Each felt that he had been spared miraculously by heaven for a special purpose in this world, and each felt it was time for a great change in the river of history. Human events, they felt, were bound to change. One of the men, the man in white, had a dream. Kind of a wild, impossible dream back in 1982. His dream was that it was time for a new era of liberty for the church in this world. Time for communism to collapse. Time for a new ordered world in which the church could go anywhere and say anything, anytime. Time, in fact, for a global government based on the principles of the Christian faith. Well, it is not very often we get a look inside the head of a great world leader, but this time we do, because a close friend of two prior popes and a confidant of the present Vatican, very literate, very well-reasoned, well-learned man by the name of Malachi Martin, has given us a look inside the head of the Pope in his fascinating book, Keys of This Blood. And this morning, let me read you the opening words of that book. You have heard them before, but they deserve to be said again because they are so filled with meaning as we go on. Keys of This Blood, page 15. Willing or not, ready or not, we are all involved in a no-holds-barred global competition about who will establish the first one-world system of government that has ever existed over the entire 6 billion people on earth. Once that competition has been decided, the world and all that's in it, our way of life as individuals, our families and our jobs, our trade and commerce, our religions, even our badges of national identity will all have been powerfully and radically altered forever. No one can be exempted from its effects. No sector of our lives will remain untouched. That was part of the dream. But the man known as the Holy Father had a further conviction that even this dream could not work in this imperfect world unless it was on the basis of the church he loved, the church he served, the church he believed in. And Malachi Martin on page 492 of the same book puts it this way: the Pope insists that men have no reliable hope of creating a viable geopolitical system unless it is on the basis of Roman Catholic Christianity. A very logical conclusion for him to come to, the one you would expect him to reach. Now that was the dream, June 7, 1982. The question I have for you is, what's wrong in this picture? In the way of that dream is a massive obstacle, isn't there? It is called the Soviet Union. In 1982, Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev is still in power. The Soviet Union is building weapons at a rate that is breathtaking. They're working on and building the Typhoon-class submarine. It's a monster of a boat. Nothing that size has ever been built by anybody else. It'll dive deeper and go faster, probably, than any boat in the world. They're working on the SS NX-24 cruise missile. If that thing gets developed, we will have from 5 to 10 minutes warning time of a nuclear attack. They're developing the most sophisticated air defense system in the world, and they're deploying the mighty SS-18 missile. That's the big one with the 10 bombs aboard, every one of which yields a megaton. Now, I happen to know this stuff just by accident. I didn't go looking for it. It came to me. About the same time, back about 1982, I got a letter from a senator from one of the western states inviting me to join an interdisciplinary group, an ad hoc committee attached to Congress on national defense. And to be perfectly frank with you, I wondered why the man had written to me. So I let the letter sit on my desk. I'd had a security clearance several years ago when I was on active duty. I had had access to some sensitive material, but I couldn't imagine that anything that I knew at this point had anything to do with current issues. Well, that's what we have wives for, isn't it, men? Give us good advice. And the best part of all is it's absolutely free. And my wife gave me some advice. She said it is very likely true that if you go to those meetings, you will have nothing whatever to contribute, but you will learn something. And you can't argue with logic like that. And so I joined up with that group, and I went back to Washington. At the very first briefing, I was fascinated to find at the podium a fellow by the name of Cap Weinberger. He's since been in the news, but back in those days it was news of a different sort. And we heard from fellows like Senator Tower of Texas, who was later proposed for Secretary of Defense. Again, fascinating man, the only member of Congress to be an enlisted man in the Navy. He was a Master Chief in the Naval Reserve. He's the only chief to whom an admiral would say, sir. Well, it was men like that we listened to. And as I went to these meetings back in Arlington, Virginia, I became convinced that we were in much more danger than I had realized before I went. Because the computers then were beginning to analyze the Soviet threat and were spitting out models of what the world could look like in a what-if situation. And the SS-18 had changed the equation. They now had firepower enough and accuracy enough to pry our land-based hardened silos right out of the ground. Some of the computers were suggesting that if we were hit with an all-out first strike and our land-based missile force was hit that hard, we would already have lost so many American people that the only rational decision a president could make would be to call the premier of the Soviet Union and say, what can we do about settling our differences and ending the war? That's how close we came. So that in 1982, when the Holy Father says it's time to end this mess and go on to a brand new world, one might have said the good gentleman means well, but he's out of touch with reality. Well, John Paul II wasn't out of touch. He saw reality more clearly than any of us could have seen it. His dream could become reality. And now we go back to that meeting in the Vatican Library as the two men sit. The Pope had a plan. And so he and the President talked privately that June day, and what emerged was what I call the battle plan for World War III. Now, few people even yet totally sense it, but I believe we have already fought World War III, and we won. We didn't fight it with bombs and bullets. We fought it with dollars and rubles. During the 1980s, the United States declared economic war on the Soviet Union, and we ruined them. Now, I, again, only recently discovered that. I was reading the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings, and in there, one of the theoreticians was talking about the last 10 years, and he mentioned the fact that we had declared economic war on the Soviet Union, and we had done it with an arms race. And all of a sudden, I thought to myself, Walton, you're dull, but you're not hopeless. There's the answer. That's what you've been living through, see? I saw it for the first time. That was the battle plan for World War III. Now, you remember in the 80s, we went to all of this military build-up, the 600-ship Navy and the Hollow Force rebuilding. Remember something called Star Wars? You remember how the Soviets screamed when we started that program, and they were able to marshal hundreds of thousands of people into the streets of Europe and in some streets in America protesting this kind of war-fighting technology. They saw what was happening. They saw that if we built this thing, they'd have to try to match us, and their economy couldn't stand it. It would kill them. So they tried to blunt the thing. And the great military arms race and arms buildup of the Reagan years was part of a plan, and that, I think, is why Dutch Reagan never varied from it, even when it seemed like a very unpopular political thing to do. He held on because there was a plan. See, the Soviets were already spending more than they could afford on armament. Now we challenge them to a race. They didn't dare race us, and they didn't dare not to. Absolutely no-win situation. Well, all of that was part of the war plan begun that day in the Vatican. Now, along with it, there were other fronts in the war. There was the economic isolation of the Soviet Union. We cut them off from trade and commerce. Remember when you'd once in a while see in the newspaper an article about a export company being prosecuted for sending illegal high-tech material to the East Bloc? Well, that's what it was all about. They simply did not have access to the high-tech stuff they needed to keep up with the West in the late 20th century. Well, meanwhile, the papacy was actively involved in this thing. They were doing covert operations in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Because, you see, the Pope had realized something. The enemy that you do not dare attack from outside, you may safely attack from where? From within. Say, what did that little lady say that plagiarized so much? We have more to fear from where? Within than from without. And so the Pope realized that he had already inside enemy territory an infrastructure that could be used. It was called the church. And priests, loyal people in the church, labor unions, remember solidarity? All were organized and combined to begin to subvert the East Bloc from the inside. Well, they got kind of clever at doing that. Using priests and labor unions, they brought in fax machines, copiers, presses, video gear, radios. Tons of stuff was smuggled into Poland. And they would fire up these transmitters that would be on the air just a few seconds so that when state television was broadcasting the party line, all of a sudden on the screen would come the words resist, solidarity lives. They had shut the transmitter down, put it in a truck, and move it. And the Soviets and Polish communists went crazy trying to triangulate in on these transmissions. They were never on the air long enough to find. And the countryside was just littered with tons of propaganda material. And so from within, the East Bloc began to fall apart. During that period of time, we have since learned that the highest levels of U.S. government and the Vatican were in close, almost daily contact. We do know that at least 6 times the apostolic delegate, Pio Laghi, came to the White House, always went to the southwest gate so he wouldn't excite the reporters watching at the more commonly used entrances, went to the White House, and his advice, in his words, was, listen to the Holy Father. We have 2,000 years experience at doing this kind of thing. Well, the plan worked pretty well. And Time magazine details the collapse of the mighty Soviet Union. Step by reluctant step, the Soviets and Communist government of Poland bowed to the moral, economic, and political pressure imposed by the Pope and the President. Jails were emptied. The country's economy collapsed in a haze of strikes and demonstrations and sanctions. In December of 1990, 9 years after being arrested, Lech Walesa became president of Poland. And within a matter of months, the Soviet Union had collapsed too. We had fought World War III, and they had lost. Well, how badly did they lose? Let me just share with you how badly they lost that war. I'm reading from U.S. News and World Report, in which it says the proud Soviet military machine that turned back Hitler at Stalingrad and challenged the West for 45 years has disintegrated. On some Russian bases, barracks have been turned into communal apartments on which 15 families huddle. Behind makeshift plywood walls, they share one kitchen and one bathroom. Red Army general was interviewed. He told a reporter that the civilian suit he was wearing he had to borrow because he couldn't afford to buy one for himself. And out in the little Siberian city of Tyumen, way out there in the outskirts of the Soviet Union, the magazine reports that there is a pathetic little market, suggesting that many are already at the point of desperation. Old men and women stand silently selling off their possession. Blocks of ice hold down grubby cloths. Yeah, in Siberia, you can use ice for a paperweight. It isn't going to melt. Blocks of ice hold down grubby cloths on which are displayed combs, buttons, bits of half-eaten food, a shoelace, 2 socks. A freezing wind is blowing, but few of the poorly clad vendors seem to notice. They have nothing else to sell, nowhere else to go, no safety net to catch them. That's how bad they lost. Now, I have heard recently some revisionist historians in the making saying that the Vatican had nothing to do with the fall of the Soviet Union. Well, if that's so, that's news to Mikhail Gorbachev. He is now a columnist for some Western papers, and in a recent column, he said that Eastern Europe's freedom could not have happened without the Pope. Now, a couple of reactions come to my mind as I think of what it was possible for that alliance to do, an alliance between the United States of America and the Vatican. The obvious one is this. If they can destroy the Soviet Union with its 30,000 nuclear devices, its 50,000 main battle tanks, and its 5 million men and women under arms, then there's very little in this world they cannot do. Point number 2, and that's the one that excites me even more. I think unwittingly, when they combined to destroy and dismember the Soviet Union, they ushered in a train of events that is going to lead this world directly and quickly to the coming of Jesus. Now, that's my conclusion. Let me give you just a few examples of why I believe that. Turn, if you will, to James chapter 5. James 5 seems rather evidently, to me at least, to be talking about an end-time world in which the old rules of economics don't seem to work so good anymore. You notice he says, "Go to now, ye rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, your garments are moth-eaten, your gold and silver is" what? Cankered. Now, does anybody have a newer translation of the Bible? Someone says corroded. Does anybody have one here that says rusted? Sure. What's wrong with that analogy? Gold and silver don't rust. Gold is so inert, you almost can't dissolve it with anything, including powerful acids. There's only about one acid I know of, aqua regia, that can take care of gold. So what is James saying? I think in graphic illustration, you're talking about the end of time. He says there will come a time when the old rules don't seem to work anymore. The economy's old rules don't work. It is as though the rules had been rewritten. The rules of chemistry had been rewritten. Nothing happens the way it's supposed to. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look at today's world. Seems to me that something is frighteningly wrong with today's world economy. And I don't think you need a PhD from Harvard School of Economics to see. In America, where we could once simultaneously fight World War II and increase our standard of living, it now takes the taxes from everybody west of the Mississippi River to pay off the national debt. Just debt service. Or at least so somebody in one of the recent political conventions claimed. In other words, for every $4.67 you pay in tax, you get back $1.81 worth of services. The rest is gone into debt. That's not just the problem in America. Talk about Japan. Have you been watching what is happening on the Nikkei index? Back in '89, the Nikkei was at nearly 39,000. It's right now somewhere around 17, but it's fallen as low as 15,000. In 2.5 years, that is the greatest erasure of wealth in the history of the world. Let's talk about Russia. Their industrial output dropped 8% this year, but inflation is raging at 900%. U.S. News and World Report puts it this way. All sides agree that Yeltsin doesn't have much time. American experts in Moscow fear a financial Chernobyl. Hyperinflation leading to a social collapse and political revolution. Something's gone berserk in the world economy, and I think one of the big reasons is that we have spent the last 10 years fighting World War III, and war is beggaringly expensive. We did something we couldn't afford to do. Point number 2. Let's turn to 1 Thessalonians 5, shall we? 1 Thessalonians 5 talks about the day of the Lord, doesn't it? But of the times and seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say peace and safety, then what happens? Sudden destruction cometh upon them, and they shall not escape. For over 50 years, we've been saying if only the Soviet Union weren't there, could have a reasonably decent, peaceful world. We could have some happiness. We wouldn't raise our kids under the shadow of a nuclear threat. Well, folks, the Soviet Union's gone, and politicians are crying peace and safety. And I guess perhaps the best example of that I have seen, this comes not from a politician but from a leading military man, are the remarks of General Colin Powell in Annapolis, Maryland, just last April, when he told the Naval Academy, "When I became chairman in the fall of 1989, Secretary Dick Cheney and I sat down, began to look at what the future might look like. The Warsaw Pact would collapse, the Berlin Wall would come down, Germany would be reunified, And by the middle of the 1990s, we would see reductions of 40 to 50% in Soviet armed forces. Logic then dictated that the entire notion of fighting a global World War III was behind us. So we're starting to disarm. Thank the Lord there are less of those weapons in the air. The less of them, the better. We're getting rid of 500,000 service people. You know that? That's the size of the force that went over and did Desert Storm, isn't it? The Air Force is cutting a third of its fighter wings. Navy's losing about 100 ships. 700 bases closing worldwide. Why? Peace and safety. We don't have the threat anymore. Say, have we ever done that before? We ever disarmed like that before? Yeah, I can think of a couple of times. One was just before Pearl Harbor. The other one was right before Korea. Now let's go to Maranatha, shall we? Maranatha, page... Let's see what page we're looking for here. We'll find it real quickly. Maranatha, page 259. While the work of salvation is closing, trouble will be coming on the earth, and the nations will be angry, yet held in check so as not to prevent the work of the third angel. Say, who is the third angel anyway? Who is that? I think I'm sitting here looking at it. I think it's you folk. So the nations are angry, yet held in check so as not to prevent your work. I was shown the inhabitants of the earth in the utmost confusion. War, bloodshed, privation, famine, pestilence were abroad. My attention then was called from the scene. There seemed to be a little time of peace. Once more the inhabitants of the earth were presented before me, and again everything was in the utmost confusion. War raged everywhere. War caused famine. What's happening in the Horn of Africa today? People are dying because they can't get enough to eat. Why? Because of war. What's happening in Yugoslavia today? People are hungry. Why? Because of war. You know, I guess she was a plagiarist, wasn't she? Finally convinced me. She copied this stuff, and I know where she got it, too. It's the L.A. Times, August of '92. War caused famine, and then men's hearts fail them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. Now, are the seeds of this kind of prophecy already blowing on the wind? Well, the events in Europe suggest it. A major news magazine put it this way: 50 years after Hitler packed Jews into boxcars, locked trains are again carrying human cargoes across Europe. The contagion threatens to force millions from their homelands and create the worst upheavals since World War II. Czech President Havel, who, by the way, isn't president anymore, warned the post-communist East might become more dangerous than communism was. And another columnist put it this way: huge, wounded, and desperate, Russia is far and away Europe's biggest security concern. The Soviet Union may have been the West's mortal enemy, but it also was a relatively stable state. Russia is racked with ethnic conflicts. Its economy is in a tailspin. Its democracy is fragile. The carnage in Yugoslavia is a sandbox compared with what could happen if the former Soviet Union's ethnic wars continues to escalate, or if Yeltsin falls prey to a growing alliance of Russian nationalists, militarists, and impoverished citizens. You see, the point I'm making is, as I look at the world I see, forces have been set in motion. They have been unleashed with the collapse of the Soviet Union that I think are so dangerous, so universal and so irreversible that very soon the only rational hope of this world will be the coming of Jesus. Now let's move real quickly to the issue of the arms race. Turn, if you would like to follow along, to the third chapter of Joel. Joel chapter 3. Third chapter of Joel is obviously an end-time prophecy because both the second and third chapters deal with the kind of allegory, the kind of language, the kind of explicit reference that can only apply clearly to the end time, I believe. May have had an application in the time of Joel, but this thing also speaks to the late 20th century. And in Joel 3:9 it says, "Proclaim ye this among the Gentiles, prepare war. Wake up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near. Let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords, your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am strong." To me, that is a graphic picture of third world nations whose limited resources should be spent on food, medicine, and housing for their people, and they're instead buying the stuff that should have gone for food. They're buying armament. Now, what kind of armament do you suppose it would take for a weak nation to suddenly say, I am strong? Well, let's talk about the Soviet Union and its nuclear weapons. With the Soviet Union, at least their 30,000 nukes were under one unified command. By the way, the uniform you see up here belonged to a person in the Red Army, actually in the Strategic Rocket Forces, whose duty it was to take care of two missiles. One of them was liquid fuel, one of them was solid fueled. Both of them were aimed across the pole. Now let's talk about those weapons. Their 30,000 nuclear weapons, I think, are now like cancer cells poised to disappear into the bloodstream of the world. A few months ago, a major news magazine had a very brief little blurb, a news item that I do not understand not getting greater attention than it did. It said that in the southern part of Russia, down in Kazakhstan, 3 tactical nuclear weapons were missing. Couldn't account for them. Now, they had inventoried all this stuff. They knew where it was. They knew where the canisters were. They were trying to get it inventoried and checked on so that they could make some orderly distribution of it or resolution of it. They went looking for 3 of them, and they cannot be found. The best guess is that those things are now somewhere in the third world, either Algeria or Iran. We know that there have been Algerian and other emissaries in the Soviet Union actively courting those who have this kind of knowledge. Now, when a Red Army general can't afford a suit of clothes, do you suppose the economic incentive on him is terribly strong? Well, I read that with some alarm because a tactical nuclear weapon is no joke. It's not the biggest thing in the world, but it'll take out about a mile of battle line. That's what you fire out of an 8-inch howitzer or a short-range missile. It scoots forward, blows up an enemy line of battle, and then with your air-conditioned, filtered hardware, you come roaring through there. And the Russians had just tons of this stuff. Their mechanized divisions were all designed to fight on a post-nuclear battlefield. So the tactical nuke's the little guy, but is not so little. Bad enough news. That's the kind you could carry in an apple crate. 2 weeks went by, same magazine came out, another little blurb, nothing much said about it, perhaps because there is concern on the part of government that citizens not become unduly alarmed. But this time, it was the other boot that fell, and this was the big one. 3 more nuclear weapons are missing, and they aren't tactical, they are strategic. Those are the ones that ride the SS-18 across the pole and deliver a megaton worth of punch. 3 of those things are gone. Question is where? Nobody really knows. Now, what did Jesus say in Luke 21? Time will come near the end of the world, just before the Lord comes, when people will look to the sky. And there shall be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, on the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. What does sea and waves refer to symbolically in the Bible? People. The sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. If you don't know Jesus, it's going to be a scary future. But what is neat about the gospel is that it operates in absolutely reverse logic from the human world. What is the saddest place you can think of in this world? It's a cemetery, isn't it? It's where you go to say goodbye. That's a tough place to be. Hardest, saddest piece of real estate in this world is the cemetery. Let me ask you something. When Jesus comes, where will the happiest places be? Right there. Jesus said, if you want to save your life, lose it. If you want to lose it, hang on to it. See, everything in the gospel works in reverse logic, and so does the end time. It's no time for you to be frightened. It's a time for you to be full of joy. I didn't say that. Jesus did. Let's take a look at Luke 21, verse 28. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up, lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Folk, if they aren't beginning to come to pass, then you're not looking at the same TV news I am. They have to be. So we have the world arms race proliferating. Once again, do you see how the collapse of the Soviet Union is the key that opens that door? Well, finally, and let's close very quickly. Revelation 13 predicts that this coalition of a great world power and a great religious power will take the world very unintentionally, I think, to a crisis of liberty, a great constitutional crisis. I don't think the end time events will come because bad men are meaning to do bad things. I think it will come because good men, wanting to save the world, wanting to help people, make decisions that in their judgment are the only decision they can make. But if they had been in the Word a little more, they'd have seen they were wrong. Now let's turn to Keys of This Blood, page 492. The Pope believes that, quote, men have no reliable hope of creating a viable geopolitical system unless it is on the basis of Roman Catholic Christianity. I can understand his coming to that conclusion. I can respond to him as a charismatic individual. I can respect his skill. But I worry when somebody has a dream like that. Because you see, what we're talking about is a return to the world of the Middle Ages. The whole world safely regimented beneath the authority and dogma of a single church. Well, once there was an obstacle in the way of that dream. It was called the Soviet Union. And it isn't there anymore. But I can think of another couple of obstacles that are still in the way of that dream. One of them is a document. It begins with the words, "We, the people of the United States." And it contains an amendment that says, Congress shall pass no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's evidently an obstacle that the Holy Father has been thinking about. From the flyleaf of Keys of This Blood, I read, and I quote, "From the first moment of his pontificate, it was John Paul's purpose to free the papacy from the straitjacket imposed upon it by the major secular powers for 200 years. That was written in 1991, I think. Go back 200 years and what was happening? The U.S. Constitution had just been adopted. The flyleaf goes on to say it was John Paul's purpose to open the floodgates of geopolitical change. We'll talk about that this afternoon right after lunch when I talk about the New World Order and the Constitution. Because there are events that are happening now within our judicial system you need to be aware of. You need to know them because they are your future, and they're your future whether you like it or not. That's where we're headed. I can think of another obstacle. It's groups of religious people, little groups. They're not so big. They're just scattered churches, a very few of them. And we have even gotten a name for those. In the situation rooms where the world's powerful people plan the future of the world, where everybody's accounted for and analyzed, those little groups of people that stand in the way have gotten a code word. They are called the provincial globalists. Another synonym for that is the minimalists. Who are they? Well, they're small religious groups that have a, quote, deeply rooted enmity for all that John Paul represents. They all arose within the context of rebellion against the authority of the Roman Church. The vast majority of them are homegrown products of the United States. They have been formed in the very womb of Western democratic principles about the rights of man. They accept the latter-day American interpretation of the wall that separates church and state. Who are they? Among those specifically named are Seventh-day Adventists. And they've been noticed as well. From page 287 of this same book, I read, they defend every person's right to be wrong. Every person must literally be assured the right to choose hell over heaven. That not only sets the minimalists apart from Pope John Paul, it sets them against him as well, because democratic principle cannot take precedence over divine revelation. Keys of this blood, 287. Now, I want to close because I know we're getting hungry. But I have to say one more thing. Whether you recognized it or not, and perhaps you did, you just got exposed to Jesuit logic. I'm not Jesuit trained. I have lots of classmates who were. I didn't go to an order school, but my 2 graduate degrees are from a Catholic institution, and I recognize Jesuit logic when I see it. I deeply admire the Jesuits. I admire anybody who's committed. We ought to be. But this is classic Jesuit logic. Don't ever argue with the Jesuit unless you know the word. Don't try it. What he is saying here, and Father Martin is an ex-Jesuit, I think. I sometimes wonder if you ever get to be, because the process you go through to become a Jesuit lasts. But Father Martin puts it this way. It is immoral to be eternally lost. The ultimate immorality is to be eternally lost. And here are these little groups of people called the minimalists saying that you have the right to say no to God and be lost forever. The ultimate immorality. And he says you don't have the right. No religion has the right to either teach or practice that kind of immorality. That's Jesuit logic. A great global dream, created in the hope of doing good and making the world's resources more equitably distributed between rich and poor. The dream of saving people from the arms race. Good goals. The Pope means to do well, and I respect him for that. But perhaps without realizing the full implications of where it goes, this dream heads us in a direction that takes the one thing out of the equation we can't afford to lose, and that is individual liberty. Once there was an obstacle in the way. Soyuz Sovietsky Socialistic Republik. Now it's gone. There are a couple of others. And the question we want to close with this morning and open with this afternoon is, might the same forces that saw the Soviet Union as an obstacle have plans for the obstacles that still remain? Thank you.
You have been listening to another special American Christian Ministries presentation. This recording has been digitally reprocessed from the original audio cassette or reel-to-reel in order to make this CD available. The audio quality was improved as much as possible. International copyright American Christian Ministries. All rights reserved. To order a copy of this or other presentations, or for a free catalog, please call toll-free 800-233-4450. International calls dial 717-652-7000. You may also order from our secure website at www.americanchristianministries.org. There you will discover the largest selection of authentic Adventist preaching available. If American Christian Ministries has been a blessing to you, why not take a moment just now and send us a note or an email with your testimony? We'll share it with our speakers and volunteer workers to encourage them. Your prayers and continued financial support are very important to ensure the continuation of this ministry as we help prepare America and the world to meet Jesus Christ. He's coming soon.